like great deals, but there is a high cost to fast fashion.
We're putting too much product out there, most of that product ending up in landfill.
The dark side to our consumption, what you don't see is this. Garbage bags filled with discarded and unused fabric. Mountains of waste from the fashion industry's design process.
Fast fashion, produced cheaply.
Too many of them arrive in unwearable condition. While the trade in used clothes has created thousands of jobs, it's also turning parts of Ghana into a toxic landfill.
Everywhere we look, companies are trying to get us to buy something. Not because we need it, but because it looks good or it's cheap. Consuming so much is wrecking the planet.
Burns, fast fashion knockoffs are harming not only independent designers, but drastically contributing to the climate crisis.
Fast fashion has a huge impact on the environment, and it contributes greatly to global climate change. And yet most people don't know exactly why fast fashion consumption is an issue. Today I'll explain the history of fast fashion, its impacts on the environment, and how we can consume less and combat fast fashion. Fast fashion is creating unsafe living conditions, polluting water and making smog, which aids to the influx of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and heating our planet. Fast fashion is defined as the mass production of clothes that represent the latest trends at high speeds and low costs to maximize profits. Like fast food, it is cheap and poor in quality. It is made so that the retailer can spend as little money as they can and sell it for as much as they can. Fast fashion is a relatively new idea. Up until the Industrial Revolution, clothing was made specifically for people, custom patterned, custom made, custom tailored by mantua makers and dressmakers. The first item of clothing to be made and sold in stores was shoes, which began in the early 18th century in France, followed by corsets, which were advertised in magazines and able to be sent away for. During the Industrial Revolution, people were able to make coats with sewing machines, which were invented in 1830 but were not used and popularized until 1889. However, menswear had been sold in ready-to-wear stores since the early 1870s, when thousands of measurements were collected and created into sizes by the Civil War Army, which could be bought and later tailored if needed. By 1915, the garment industry had grown to be the third largest after steel and oil. When immigrants moved to New York, often without much money in their pockets and many children, they would get easy employment in clothing factories. They would earn from $1 to $1.50 a week. Children over 12 did not have to attend school, so they would earn extra money to support their families. Clothing companies were greedy, and if you ran your finger through with a sewing machine, there was always a line of hungry children to replace you. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory began to lock their employees, who were mostly young Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrant women, in their hot and dirty working environment. And on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out. The young female employees were forced to jump from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors, or to burn and inhale the toxic fumes from the burning asbestos and equipment. 146 people died, and the fire caused 78 non-fatal injuries. This started a conversation about worker safety, and in October of 1911, the state of New York passed the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which required factory owners to install sprinkler systems in their factories. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the department store grew in popularity, and so did more simple and easily manufactured styles of clothing. And throughout the Great Depression, terrible wages, child labor, and bad work conditions continued to be an issue. By 1929, you had to stay in school until you were 15 years old, and factory conditions began to be checked more often. During the Second World War, cotton began to be rationed, and women entered the workforce. And although it wasn't prevalent until the 1960s, polyester began to make its way into the garment industry to help with the fabric restrictions. Skirts also had to become shorter to conserve fabric, and pleats, ruffles, pockets, hoods, and shawls were prohibited by the U.S. Army. By the 1960s, mass production was the primary source of clothing, and custom-tailored items were reserved for the wealthy and for red carpet events. Rationing, though not as strict, was starting again because of the Vietnam War. Fast fashion really became an issue in the 1980s. Department stores became malls, where you could buy many of the same article of clothing for cheap. Polyester was very prevalent, and water-resistant fabric was invented. This was the true start of the fast fashion issue. Clothing also began to be manufactured in other countries, where it didn't cost as much to produce, and because work conditions were not as regulated, and the employment of children was not illegal. With the internet and the popularization of online fast fashion websites such as Amazon, Shein, and Fashion Nova, also with the popularization of haul videos, fast fashion items are more accessible than ever, and advertisements make sure to sell you those unethical brands over and over and over again. Okay, now that we have an understanding of the history of fast fashion and its origins, let's continue on to our next topic.
But I recognize this shirt. It's a tan.
Most clothing brands these days are fast fashion brands. Shein is a big one, so is Target, Uniqlo, Fashion Nova, Justice, Zara, Gap, Forever 21, H&M, Old Navy, Walmart's clothing lines, and places like Wish and Amazon. My hypothesis is that if this continues, more children will be subjected to child labor, more water will be polluted, rainforests will be cut down at higher rates, and CO2 will continue to be released into the atmosphere. Chemicals used to make pseudo-fabrics, such as polyester, have leaked into waterways, contaminating the water source for people who live around the factories. That's creating inability to grow food, and people dying because they cannot feed their families. Polyester and other pseudo-fabrics cannot break down and decompose. Therefore, when there are changes in weather and landforms, they will be carried away into bodies of water and pollute the ocean, killing fish. Then people will have to keep going out farther and deeper to find the fish, leading to overfishing of species that cannot accommodate for human consumption. They will go extinct or become endangered. Then predators will go hungry, as will their predators, and so on, which will go on to create an influx of some fish, and the fish who are no longer being eaten will be overpopulated and will eat all of their natural food. That will disrupt the entire marine food chain, which will affect the land animals which hunt the fish, and will in turn affect almost every living thing on the planet. Factories use a lot of natural resources. They burn coal, creating CO2, which creates a thicker layer of greenhouse gases because of less tree populations in areas where these factories are. The air is not clean. In China, there is so much smog that people pre-pandemic had to wear purifying masks. The last effect I'm going to mention is human. Besides the contamination, just like in the early 1900s, children as young as 6 are working in these conditions. They are hungry and thirsty and live in inhumane conditions. They are abused because no one cares. Some are even child brides, married as young as 8. There are no easy fixes, to be honest, but there are ways that you can help. Don't shop at the aforementioned fast fashion brands. Shop more from thrift stores. Shop less. The last one is the best one. Did you know that the average person doesn't wear 50% of their wardrobe? Many people buy fast fashion because they like what they saw. They think that they'll wear the clothes, but they don't. They end up just throwing them away. Don't. Donate them. Buy things you can mix and match. And just buy less. It's as easy as that. I have a hard time with that. Don't go on websites like Shein or watch haul videos. And if you must buy something, try to find it in a thrift store. But I just implore you to try to consume less clothing. Lastly, I'd like to bring up this common misconception. Vegan leather is not good for the environment. Real leather lasts longer, is better for the environment, and therefore is better for animals. Vegan leather is made of plastic. Real leather will decompose. It will also last you 25 years compared to vegan leather shoes that'll last you maybe 5. You can also make your own clothing and spend money, if you must, on well-made, homemade, custom-made items from places like Etsy. Support small businesses.
Is an investment. It is something that when it's well made, when it's made of decent, good quality materials, and when it's made to last, will last you a significant portion of your lifetime, as it did all throughout history. Historically, here's how fashion worked. Before fast fashion, before we are literally destroying our environment with the textile industry, which is one of the most destructive industries in the world right now. Basically, the whole point of this experiment was to expose the reality of how much garments cost, how much labor goes into things, how much the materials cost, and the quality that can come out of it, versus the concessions that are made in terms of ethics, in terms of labor, in terms of quality of material, in terms of durability of material, to get something that is not flattering, will not last you, but is cheap. It makes me really mad. So how did we even get here? How did we even get to the point of exploiting people and literally dressing ourselves in plastic that shreds and then ends up in landfills and then destroys the environment? Where did we go wrong? How did people clothing in history before we ended up here, and how can we go back there? Maybe clothing took time. If we're going before machinery, before sewing machines, it took time to make because you had to do it all by hand. It took, everything took time to make, from the weaving of the material, which was done by hand. That would have cost you a lot of money. It was so valuable. In fact, so valuable that even in high fashionable elite like court dress, beautiful silk brocades, there's like piecing everywhere on the front of garments, just unashamed piecing, because fabric, especially those expensive silks, were hugely valuable, and there was no point in wasting them because they were so expensive. So your fabric was expensive, your labor was expensive because it took so long to make this stuff. Obviously, the exploitation of garment workers is nothing new. Garment workers throughout all of history have a unfortunate history of just never really making enough to live, just because the amount of time that it takes to produce a single garment by hand is pretty daunting. So somewhere along the lines, we just lost sight of the fact that clothing, craftsmanship, is supposed to be an investment. And I'm not saying clothing should only be for the elite, because people wore clothes all throughout history. All classes of people wore clothes. I think we've just become so reliant on the fast-paced change of fashion. There's so many different styles of clothing that show up every year and then go away the next year, like those mullet skirts of 2012 that are now not seen anymore. Like, where did they all go? Are they all in landfills? Surely people are not cutting them up into other stuff, because who does that nowadays? It's just not part of our daily routine anymore. But whereas if you go back through history, you can pinpoint, this is 1880s, this is 1860s, this is 1750s, this is the 16th century. These time periods have very specific silhouettes because fashion changed at a more gradual rate, because people were paying more for their clothing. Clothing cost money. You weren't just going to buy something, wear it for 2 years, and then throw it away. You're going to buy something, wear it until either it wore out and you cut it up into rags or something, or if you are fashionable, you cut it up and make it into the fashionable silhouette, because the fashionable silhouette always sort of builds on what was before. So big, large skirts are in fashion this decade, and then by the next decade, people are starting to sweep them up and bustle them back. It's all the same sort of starting point of dress. It's just you're doing different things with the same source material, if that makes sense. Nowadays, we're just like, mullet skirts are in one season, and then the next season, maxi dresses are in fashion the next season. So it's like, how do you turn a mullet skirt into a maxi dress? You kind of can't. You have to go to H&M and buy new clothing. So much clothing is now out in the world and exists right now. So there's no shortage of garments. Obviously, you go to a charity shop, but these charity shops don't necessarily keep everything that they're donated. Sites like Poshmark and Depop and Facebook groups of trading clothing. There's so much clothing out there. There is no reason why we should be producing clothing at this rate.
Fashion is a huge problem in our first world, over-consuming society, and we have to stop it. It is not good for us or the environment. We have to consume less or buy from second-hand shops. We can't continue to support these big corporations, or there will be no future for our human race. I learned a lot about the roots of fast fashion and the ways to prevent it. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something about fast fashion and the ways to prevent it. Goodbye.